Hey gang, a while back I got some walnut logs. It was about a year ago now. And at the time I thought, hey, I'm just going to turn these into some usable lumber and make something cool out of them. It was a good plan, but what I failed to realize is that I don't have the tools capable of doing that. I'm still planning on turning these logs into something beautiful. I'm just not exactly sure how it's going to go. So follow along and see what happens. Hey gang, a project so nice I'm introducing it twice. This build, I tried a lot of new techniques, so it was the first time I've done a lot of these things before, and I refreshed myself on some things that I have not done in quite some time. So this project really epitomizes my slogan: mistakes were made and projects were delayed, but it was a great challenge which I always appreciate, and so I hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. You know it's going to be a good video when it starts with a chainsaw. I'm just cutting these to the right thickness, and then I'm going to cut a nice flat edge on each one using my jointer jig and my table saw. Once I have a flat side on each piece of wood, I can start making the angled cuts for my hexagons. Geometry fans will not be disappointed. For the second cut on each piece, I set the first piece of my jig at 120 degrees. Once I have the second cut made on each piece of wood, I'll put in the next piece of the jig, and then I can make the rest of the cuts. When cutting out your hexagons, I highly recommend double and triple checking your angles, because if they're even slightly off, it makes for a pretty challenging glue up. I may or may not be speaking from experience on this. Once you have the first two cuts made, the next four are pretty much smooth sailing, but I still passed each piece past the blade on all 6 sides just to be safe. It might be time for a new table saw blade. I'm guessing all that smoke isn't a good thing. When I finished cutting out all the hexagons, I laid them all out on my workbench to get a general idea of how I wanted to lay them out, but once I started gluing them up, I completely forgot what layout I was going with, and I did something else. I saw an old guy on the internet glue up his wood like this, without any clamps or anything, saying that the pressure from the 2 pieces of wood, or from the wood on the top piece, would be enough to make a good glue up. We'll see how it goes. Probably not a strategy I'll stick with for the entire glue up. I very intentionally made the top of my workbench out of melamine so that I could do glue ups like this one and other panels without having to cover it or worry about it sticking to my work surface. Hopefully that's how it works out. I was not very confident in my glue job on this project, so even after I glued everything together, I went back over it and filled in some of the smaller cracks with wood glue, and then, as you'll see a little later on, I filled some of the bigger gaps with epoxy. If anybody wants to buy me a thickness planer and or a jointer, I might consider trying to do this again. Just shoot me an email and we can work out the details, or you can mail me a big bag of money. Either one will do. Believe it or not, this is not the most sanding that I have had to do on a project. Alright, now that everything is nice and smooth, we're ready to fill in some of the bigger gaps with epoxy. There were plenty of them. I'm using Pro Marine tabletop epoxy for this. It's probably not the best choice, but it's what I had. And then to color match it a little bit better, I added in some of the sawdust from my walnut, hoping that that would help everything blend in a little bit better. It worked okay. I don't know. Maybe I'll try it again, maybe I won't. I'm kind of indifferent at this point. I went a little heavy on the epoxy here. I've done quite a bit of gap filling with epoxy, but it's usually been smaller knot holes and things like that. So I've used a quicker drying epoxy, which isn't nearly as runny. So this was a bit of a learning experience. And the curve was not kind to me. I had a little bit of bleed out from the epoxy on the other side, but it was a pretty thin layer, so it wasn't too bad to sand off. Because I wasn't terribly confident with my glue up, I wanted to try and fill in as many of the gaps and cracks as I could to try and shore up the structure and make sure that nothing came apart when I trimmed the edges. So that's why I did this now, as opposed to waiting until everything was trimmed and ready to go. I bought this table saw used a couple of years ago, and it must have come with like 5 blades and a dado stack, but I don't think a single one of those blades is sharp, so I'm probably going to need some new blades here soon. Shh, don't tell my wife. Just a little more sanding here for good measure. This is when I did sort of the final sanding. I started with 40 grit and worked my way up to 400 grit or 800 grit or something crazy like that. Simply because I had the pads to do it, not because it was necessary. In the interest of time, I made a separate video on how to make an epoxy mold to keep this one a little bit shorter. So rest assured, if you were hoping to see a rank amateur make an epoxy mold, you will not be disappointed. You just might have to wait a couple more weeks. I painted on 3 thin coats of epoxy, letting it dry between each coat to try and seal up the wood and prevent bubbles for my 4th flood coat, which is a little thicker. The flood coat's exactly what it sounds like. It's just basically pouring epoxy onto your project. I built this mold to prevent spills and messes, but in hindsight, it probably wasn't necessary. I probably should have just dammed up the sides and done it that way so that I'd have a nice uniform coat, and then I would have had to pour it again on the bottom side following the same process. But I didn't do that, and now I have to pay the price. This is actually my first of what ended up being 4 final coats, and I would have done a 5th, but my producer told me we didn't have enough money budgeted for a 5th coat of epoxy. Coat number 1 needed to be redone because of some massive bubbles, but again, in the interest of time, I made a separate video showing you how to fix those. Cutting this beveled edge was my attempt to clean up what could only be described as a giant mess. I think it helped, but at this point in time, there was no salvaging the bottom, let alone the entire build. Here we have the male of the species desperately clinging to a project that was doomed from the beginning. I'm not sure what it is about this species. They're just unwilling to call it quits, even in the face of failure. I'm pretty sure I'm prepping for final coat number 2 in this clip, which I applied after I fixed some massive bubbles, but I can't remember because I did so many final coats on here. I had to do final coat number 3 after I accidentally drilled through the top of the table. Yeah, bummer. However, I take no blame for final coat number 4. That was a natural disaster. A moth landed in my wet epoxy and made a big mess of it, so not my fault. Moving along, nothing you haven't seen here before, just a grown man crying into some epoxy. Alright, let's start working on the base. Maybe this will be a little bit less depressing. I started each cut with a hacksaw, and then I finished the cuts with my reciprocating saw. I did this to give myself sort of a notch to put the reciprocating saw in so that the blade didn't jump around so much. Peekaboo! If you're prone to seizures or have light sensitivity, now would be a good time to look away. I have welded before, but it's been about 12 years, so this was a bit of a struggle. For that reason, I won't be handing out all sorts of welding advice, but if there are any seasoned welders watching this video, please give me your top 5 tips for a good weld, because I would love to hear them. I'm really more of a theoretical welder, but I will recommend wearing pants and a long sleeve shirt and shoes instead of whatever those things I have on my feet are called. We're just about done. What a wild ride this was. Just drilling the holes to attach the top, and then I'll countersink them. I actually did that one on the wrong side, but I countersunk the rest of them on the correct side. Right about here is where I drilled clean through the top of the table, so that's why I had to do final coat number 3. It seems like the big time woodworkers always use screw inserts, and since I want to be big time too, I decided to use them as well, although it's basically like polishing a turd at this point. A little spray paint and we're ready to attach the top. Oh boy. Well, it didn't exactly turn out how I hoped it would, but it's not terrible either. So I guess it's right in that sweet spot. Who wants a perfect coffee table anyway? Oh boy, see those holes? Yep, screws went a little too far in. Better luck next time, I guess. If you want to give me a pity like for this video, it would be much appreciated. Thanks for watching The Weekend Woodworker, where as always, mistakes were made, and this project was definitely delayed.